So we do see that the transatlantic relations are fragmenting, and this, I guess, derives from the dispute over Greenland, but also the pending defeat of Ukraine, or NATO's defeat in Ukraine. But 4 years ago, when the Russians went into Ukraine, there seemed to be a consensus in the media that, and by the politicians, that NATO would now be stronger than ever, given that we face this Russian threat. Uh, with an exception of you, though, within the first weeks, I think you said something along the line that this would end with NATO's possible collapse. I was wondering, yeah, how could you see this coming? Because no one's denying the fragmentation anymore.
Actually, I told, I think it was Dimitri Symes or George Beebe, can't remember which one, in an interview with the National Interest in January of 2022 before the Russians went in. Two things: that first, the Russians would very definitely intervene militarily. And a lot of people in Washington and in Europe all said, oh no, the Russians will never do this. It would destroy their economy. And the regime can't withstand that. No, the Russians will never go into Ukraine. They will not do this. And so I said, yes, they will. And then I said that if they do, NATO will not survive the crisis. Now, why did I say that? I think because a substantial portion of my career involved service in the U.S. military inside the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I think that's important to understand. I was there for the first time. I came in March of 77, and my assignment for most of the time that I was there in 77, and I was there until 1980, was service on the border with Czechoslovakia and East Germany. And so I had a lot of interaction with many, many people. I had a chance to see the Warsaw Pact forces. And I concluded three things. First of all, that the Warsaw Pact was not going to attack, that the Soviets were not going to risk a war, that they were effectively defending what they had gained as a result of the collapse of German military power at the end of the Second World War. Secondly, that, the NATO alliance was a conglomeration of different national military establishments. And this is not conducive to success on the battlefield. And that in most cases, the smaller nations, the Dutch, the Belgians, and I saw both of them in the field, as well as the Canadians, the British, and ultimately the French, everyone was sort of a limited liability partner, as we say. They were there because they saw it as being in their interest to be there, but they really weren't prepared to fight anybody. And their focus was extraterritorial. This is particularly true for the French and the British, the Belgians, and the Dutch, because they were former colonial powers and they all had interests overseas. Now, that was my first tour, and I worked closely with German military units, and I concluded that the Germans were the only ones that were adequately equipped and trained to fight effectively against the Soviets if anything happened. So then I spent time in graduate school in Munich and in Vienna in 1983 and 84. This was when I was writing my master's, and I went to those places to see to talk to members of the mutual balanced force reduction talks that were both Soviet and non-Soviet, as well as the U.S. side. And again, I reached very similar conclusions about what I thought was realistic. And then in 1986, I was assigned briefly for about 6 weeks to an office in the Pentagon that used to be called Net Assessment. And it was a very useful assignment because I was able to read translated works from the Soviet General Staff Journal, which were extraordinarily highly classified at the time. And these were very informative insofar as the Soviet understanding of us and our understanding of them. And they pointed out that we had performed very poorly during the Second World War, the Anglo-British alliance, because we managed the forces as though they were separate countries. And there were limited authorities exercised by Eisenhower and others whenever they commanded Canadian, French, non-American forces. And so he's basically said, you can't run a war this way. And if you fight somebody as competent as the Germans, you have no chance of success at all. So the bottom line is I went back then as a major. I served again on the border briefly. And then I went to Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. And I was there from November 1997 until January 2000. And what I saw was evidence for the same problem. Everyone had their own agenda. They only temporarily or briefly cooperated, and there had to be an incentive for them to cooperate. There had to be some payoff to get people to join together to do much of anything. The exercises that we did conduct were not very realistic. So the point is, when this happened, a couple of things were very obvious to me. Russia was now a Russian state, which meant they had unity of command, unity of effort. Everybody spoke the same language. There were no disputes about who was going to command what. And NATO remained exactly what it was, a chorus of competing voices that couldn't agree on much of anything. And I didn't see much evidence that regardless of what Ukraine did, that it could outlast the Russians. Ukraine wasn't large enough, didn't have the scientific industrial base, didn't have the manpower. And we knew almost from the outset that, the Ukrainian population was diminishing in size, not just for reasons of fecundity or the lack thereof, but because Ukrainians didn't want to fight in the war, so large numbers of people left. And then, of course, you have the corruption issues. So I don't think it was, I know a lot of people say, oh, well, how could you possibly have figured that out? But if anybody looked at any of the things I've described objectively, it was hard not to reach that conclusion. The one thing that I did not anticipate was that the Russians would move as cautiously and slowly at the beginning as they did. And I didn't understand the true state of affairs with the Russian army. The Russian army was designed for territorial defense, nothing else. So that's why all these claims of Putin's determination to rebuild the Soviet empire, that's all nonsense, always was. Today, they have an army that is second to none, in my judgment, in many respects. But at the time, it wasn't up to the task that it was assigned. And it took a year and a half to really build up that force to what you see today. So I guess that's the easiest explanation. And everyone else, and this is true in Washington as well as in the capitals of Europe, Glenn, everyone suffers from a terminal case of wishful thinking. You know that. I mean, they fully believe in all the nonsense that is now crashing and burning so badly over in Davos and also in all of Europe's capitals about this thing we call NATO and the European Union.
The wishful thinking is definitely what's bringing down Europe. But but what I think was interesting in the 1990s was a lot of people who knew that NATO expansion would create these problems. You had the people opposed it, be it George Kennan or the U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry, but you also had people like Madeleine Albright who recognized that Russia would feel encircled and this could alienate the Russians, but she still supported it with the logic that, well, if we end up in a conflict with Russia, at least then NATO will be there, a huge, much larger, more powerful NATO. So when we now end up in this war, or proxy war, direct war, however one wants to define it with Russia, the Europeans seems to think, well, we can now retreat into a new Cold War. That is, the Europeans and America essentially go back to the past, and we do the same thing over again. And the political leadership as well as the political commentary can't seem to understand why America's not joining in on this. Why aren't you joining us for another Cold War?
Well, a couple of things we need to admit up front. If you look at Stoltenberg or his successor, Rutte, there is no reward in Europe right now for, I would say, men and women of character and intelligence. You are rewarded for mouthing the same stupidities over and over and over again, repeating aphorisms that make no sense, of maintaining the fiction that things are better than they are or that there are capabilities on hand that don't exist. You're not going to be rewarded for standing up and say, well, this is ridiculous nonsense. The argument that I made from the beginning, and there were a few other people who said, we have an interest in ending this war in Ukraine as soon as possible. This is going to be a terrible tragedy for Eastern Europe and ultimately for Europe in general if we're not careful. The longer this lasts, the greater the probability that something really bad could happen. Of course, at that point, I did not appreciate the extent to which Putin would exercise restraint, which he has, remarkably. And that's not something that has made him popular with certain people in Russia. There are a lot of Russians, and I'm sure you're aware of this, who would like to see NATO taught a very valuable lesson on a permanent basis. So you're asking now, well, what happened with the United States? Well, President Trump is not someone who is steeped in research and understanding of anything. But President Trump, if he sticks with them, has pretty good instincts. And his instincts told him, this is back during his first term, what are we doing in Europe? It's been 75 years, 70 years. What are we doing there? And he's right. What are we still in Korea 70 years later? This is crazy. This all ought to end. To that extent, he shared President Eisenhower's view that what we should be interested in is a Europe without us. Remember, Eisenhower said, if we are still in Europe as a result of this NATO alliance in 10 years, well, then we failed, because the goal should be to get out. And that was the traditional American view, and a very healthy one, I would add. But it was also a view that the permanent hostility with the Soviet Union at that point was not an answer to the problem, that we had to come up with a way of interacting with the Soviets, whether we liked the way they governed or not. And he felt that way. I think that President Trump, early on, his view was, why are we in this sort of position of permanent hostility to Russia? So that was always there. Unfortunately, once he got in, he was surrounded by the usual permanent residents of the ring around Washington we call the Beltway. And there was, oh, you can't do that. You can't just leave. You can't go here. You can't exchange this. Can't you? Pretty soon, if you listen to everybody in Washington, the one message that comes through over and over and over again is you can't change anything. Because if you change something, you disrupt the money flow. All the think tanks that you have inside the Beltway are essentially resting on a foundation of permanent hostility to Russia, permanent hostility to China, permanent hostility to Iran, and absolute unconditional support for whatever Israel wants. That's the standard. You have to look at who their donors are, who provides them with money. And suddenly it's pretty obvious that the people pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into these places are absolutely adamantly opposed to any change that would end our position in all of these regions, change our position globally. But President Trump has never completely given up on it. He just doesn't know how to do it. And he has surrounded himself with people who, frankly, are not much more knowledgeable than he is about the world, but they all know that they too have an interest in ensuring the money flow doesn't stop, from which they also benefit. That's the problem when you surround yourself with billionaires.